Welcome, everybody. Thanks to all of you for coming to hear Sarah Waters in conversation with me today. My name is Sophie Cunningham. Sarah, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sarah, and then she's going to read from her latest novel, The Paying Guest, and then we'll move into more of a conversation. Sarah was born in Wales in 1966. She has a PhD in English literature and has lectured a lot. She's written 6 novels, which is why we're here today. Tipping the Velvet in 1998, which won, and I'm actually not going to list all the awards because almost all your books have won various awards. Affinity was published in 1999, Fingersmith in 2002. That was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize and the Orange Prize, which is obviously very significant, and both prizes being very significant. The Night Watch in 2006, also shortlisted for the Man Booker and the Orange. The Little Stranger in 2009, also shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. And The Paying Guest, which came out last year and was shortlisted for, well, now the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction, was formerly known as the Orange Prize. She's been included in Granta's prestigious list of Best of Young British Novelists, and has been voted Author of the Year at various points by various bookshops. So she's a very significant English writer, and it's a real honour for us to have her here with us today. And Sarah, do you want to just leap in and read to us from The Paying Guest?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. It is very nice to be here. I'm going to read from just sort of 4 or 5 minutes from quite near the beginning of The Paying Guest, so it should work as a nice introduction. The Paying Guest is set in London in 1922, and its main character, Frances Ray, is a youngish spinster in the language of the day, living with her widowed mother in a middle-class house. And like lots of middle-class people in this period, they're short of cash. They've lost their servants, and to make ends meet, they've had to bring in lodgers, the paying guests of the title. And the paying guests in this case are Mr. and Mrs. Barber, Leonard and Lillian, a young married couple who are distinctly lower middle class, Clark class, as they're rather snootily called. And they've moved in on the Saturday. Frances has watched, rather appalled, as their gaudy Clark class furniture has been brought into the house. And but Mrs. Barber, she has found to be unexpectedly rather nice. Anyway, now it's the Monday morning, and Mr. Barber's gone to work. Frances's mother has gone out, and Frances is taking the opportunity to do some housework. She's washing the hall floor. Mrs. Barber has appeared in her nightgown and kimono, asking if she can have a bath. And Frances tells her that she and her mother have forgotten to light the geyser, the hot water geyser, and has offered to do it for her. So she's held out her hand to help Mrs. Barber across the wet floor. Mrs. Barber was on the bottom stair now, and clearly doubtful about where to step to. After the slightest of hesitations, she took the hand that Frances offered, braced herself against her grip, then made the small spring forward to the unwashed side of the floor. Her kimono parted as she landed, exposing more of her nightdress and giving an alarming suggestion of the rounded, mobile, unsupported flesh inside. They went together through the kitchen and into the scullery. The bath was in there beside the sink. It had a bleached wooden cover used by Frances as a draining board. With a practiced movement, she lifted this free and set it against the wall. The tub was an ancient one that had been several times re-enamelled, most recently by Frances herself, who was not quite sure of the result. The iron struck her, today especially, as having a faintly leprous appearance. The Vulcan geyser was also rather frightful, a greenish riveted cylinder on 3 bowed legs. It must have been the top of its manufacturer's range in about 1870, but now looked like the sort of vessel in which someone in a Jules Verne novel might make a trip to the moon. "It has a bit of a temperament, I'm afraid," she told Mrs. Barber. "You have to turn this tap, but not this one. You might blow us sky high if you do. The flame goes here." She struck a match. "Best to look the other way at this point. My father lost both his eyebrows doing this once. There." The flame, with a whoosh, had found the gas. The cylinder began to tick and rattle. She frowned at it, her hands at her hips. "What a beast it is. I am sorry, Mrs. Barber." She gazed right round the room, at the stone sink, the copper in the corner, the mortuary tiles on the wall. "I do wish this house was more up to date for you." But Mrs. Barber shook her head. "Oh, please don't wish that." She tucked back a curl of hair. Frances noticed the piercing for her earring, a little dimple in the lobe. "I like the house just as it is," she said. "It's a house with a history, isn't it? Things, well, they oughtn't always to be modern. There'd be no character if they were." And there it was again, thought Frances, that niceness, that kindness, that touch of delicacy. She answered with a laugh, "Well, as far as character goes, I fear this house might be rather too much of a good thing, but I'm glad you like it. I'm very glad. I like it too, though I'm apt to forget that. Now, we oughtn't to let this geyser get hot without running some water, or there'll be no house left to like and no us to do the liking. Do you think you can manage? If the flame goes out, give me a call." Mrs. Barber smiled, showing neat white teeth. "I will. Thank you, Miss Ray." Frances left her to it and returned to her wet floor. The scullery door was closed behind her and quietly bolted. But the door between the kitchen and the passage was propped open, and as Frances retrieved her cloth, she could hear very clearly Mrs. Barber's preparations for her bath, the rattle of the chain against the tub, followed by the splutter and gush of the water. The gushing, it seemed to her, went on for a long time. She had told a fib about her and her mother's use of the geyser. It was too expensive to light often. They drew their hot water from the boiler in the old-fashioned stove. They bathed at most once a week, frequently taking turns with the same bath water. If Mrs. Barber were to want baths like this on a daily basis, their gas bill might double. But at last the flow was cut off. There came the splash of water and the rub of heels as Mrs. Barber stepped into the tub, followed by a more substantial liquid thwack as she lowered herself down. After that, there was a silence, broken only by the occasional echoey plink of drips from the tap. Like the parted kimono, the sounds were unsettling. The silence was most unsettling of all. Sitting at her bureau a short time before, Frances had been picturing her lodgers in purely mercenary terms as something like 2 great waddling shillings. But this, she thought, shuffling backward over the tiles, this was what it really meant to have lodgers, this odd, unintimate proximity, this rather peeled-back moment where the only thing between herself and a naked Mrs. Barber was a few feet of kitchen and a thin scullery door. An image sprang into her head, that round flesh crimsoning in the heat. She adjusted her pose on the mat, took hold of her cloth, and rubbed hard at the floor. Okay, thanks.
One of the things that struck me when I read the first of your novels that I read, which was Night Watch, was your interest in class and periods of time in English history where class is beginning to collapse. But of course, as I've read more and more of your novels, it's a bit like this slow motion car crash, isn't it? So with Tipping the Velvet, there's sort of late Victorian era, there's a kind of, maybe class isn't collapsing, but characters move between class. And certainly The Paying Guest is explicitly about that moment where people couldn't afford, after World War I, where there's so much economic change and indeed cultural change that people are being thrown together in these kind of unlikely combinations. Did you set out to kind of critique or write about class, or is this just something that I think happens inevitably to English novelists because class is such a pervasive part of life?
It is a bit hard to miss when you're writing about British history in particular, because it has been such an organising factor of people's lives. But I think you're right too, that class is always more complicated than we think it is, and there's always been more room for negotiation and for subversion. And certainly starting in the Victorian period, it's true that, a novel like Tipping the Velvet, which is very much about cross-dressing in gender terms, a woman dressing as a man, becoming a male prostitute, there's lots of blurring along those lines. But Nancy's journey in that novel is also sort of, inflected by class. And certainly by the time I was writing a novel like Fingersmith, which is my third novel, there's another sort of cross-dressing going on, which is people passing themselves off as the class that they don't really belong to, which, of course, at a time when what you wore was limited. People's wardrobes were very, very limited, especially if they were poor. You might have one dress, one good dress, and that was about it. What you wore placed you in class terms. And so to dress in a very different kind of way people read you, I think. People would read the surface and sort of take it as read. And what happens when you get into the 20th century is that those things are beginning to break down. And certainly in the early 20s, I mean, this was such a fascinating time in terms of class in Britain, because middle-class people like Frances and her mother in the book were losing money, had lost money, were losing status. They certainly were losing servants in the way they used to have them. And it was a great time for the lower middle classes, the clerk class, because there was this enormous increase in the number of white-collar jobs available to people. So people whose parents would have been solidly working class and living in very uncertain, in a very uncertain way as a result. Their children would have become lower middle class. They would have had better job security, more leisure hours, better income, and clothes were becoming. It was possible to get off the peg clothes in a way it just hadn't been before. And there was a great deal of unease amongst the middle classes as a result.
So Lillian could be very elegantly dressed despite not
exactly.
being hugely
So
well-off.
lower middle class people, even working class people, could suddenly look very respectable, And so for the middle classes, this was very worrying. How did you then distinguish yourself from the lower orders, if not by class? And there's a fantastic book by a woman called Nicola Humble called The Feminine Middle Brow Novel.
Nicola Humble.
Humble.
Great
Name, isn't it?
Yeah.
Talking about, there's this whole rash of novels, mainly by women in the 20s and 30s and 40s, this very mid-20th century period in which middle-class people become bohemian. Things like The Constant Nymph by Margaret Kennedy, The Brontes Went to Woolworths by Rachel Ferguson. It's a great title, or a rather snobbish kind of book. The Fountain Overflows, a favourite book of mine by Rebecca West. It's about sort of shabby gentility, and it's a way of sort of rescuing the middle classes, giving them an identity. They didn't have servants, but that was okay, because they were bohemian. They loved having picnic teas, And it was a time of crisis, in a way, about class relations. And so, yes, the Paying Guest is very firmly in the midst of those changes.
And one, as I've already mentioned, and it is obvious to most of the people here who've read your books, you really engage with history. And I wanted you to talk a little bit more about, the research sounds like a boring way of, it makes the question sound more boring than I intended to be. What I'm interested in is the way you managed to kind of really get to the atmosphere of what it was like to live through very particular times, which you do in this. In The Night Watch, there's that kind of the collapse of the social order is around World War II and the Blitz. In Little Stranger, there's that sort of, again, it was post-World War II, the kind of those shifts. But you're also writing about secret histories, which is the way that, as you say, people who cross gender boundaries and sexual boundaries. And is that kind of history on the public record? How do you kind of find that those more private histories? How have you been able to kind of access them as a researcher and writer?
Well, I love research, I must say, and what I also love is then using the research to create something of my own. Making that imaginative leap, really, from the facts to this story with these made-up people and characters. And there are lots of different ways of writing historical novels. There's lots of room, I think, for invention and imagination and anachronism. I think that can be. But for me, I like to try and recover, or create the illusion of recovering the mentality of a period, the idiom of a period, and through the physical artifacts of a period. For me, I'm interested in the way the past is different from the present. Even the 80s now is different from our period. Even the 90s, and to try and capture that specific flavour of a period, which isn't just a surface thing. It's about. It's about the very intimate things in our lives that we tend to think are beyond history. The way we feel about our bodies and the way we use domestic space and the way we have sex. They're all, they have a script, those things, a historical script. So, yes, I always want to try and capture those things and sort of take a reader with me, really. And as to how I do it, it's a question of reading about a period, but more usefully for me reading stuff from a period. So newspapers were a great resource for this novel, partly because there's a kind of crime in it, and I looked at some real-life murder cases. In fact, one of them was sort of an inspiration. We could talk about that in a minute if you like, but newspapers gave me the structure of how that kind of thing would play out, with the police involvement and then going to court and things like that. But more generally, reading novels from a period is a great source for me, just to get the feel of the language and sometimes really popular novels, which have now, of course, been completely forgotten, are the most useful of all. So when I started work on The Paying Guest, not knowing much about the 1920s, I went to what I did know, which was Virginia Woolf and D.H. Lawrence and Aldous Huxley. I read their novels, and as much as I admired them, I just got nowhere with them, I just couldn't identify with their characters. They were either extreme in the case of Lawrence's characters, or they were high, sort of bohemian or high society in the case of Virginia Woolf, say. But that made me realize I wanted to write about much more sort of ordinary people, like suburban people or lower middle class people.
So how did you come to the novel? Did you make a decision to write about a period? Were you interested in writing a crime novel? What came first?
The period came first. And with me, often I'll go to a period because I know a little bit about it. Even if it is only just a little bit, it's enough. So say with The Night Watch, which is set in Second World War in London and just after the war, I just knew a little bit about women's experiences in wartime that paradoxically for some women had been very exciting. There'd been lots of new opportunities opened up to them, job-wise and just life-wise. And then with the end of war, there'd been a kind of closing down of those opportunities and a kind of flatness for lots of women, I think, after the war. That was my starting point. That was what I went to my research with. But with this book, I was intrigued by the 20s. It was the bit in between periods I'd written about before. And I went there really not knowing much except for stereotypes about flappers and, thoroughly modern Millie, kind of twirling beads and things like that. And I realized immediately how limited that was and wanting to get beyond it. And then the crime business came because I began to think, well, how can I get information about more ordinary people? And I remembered this case from 1922, the Edith Thompson and Frederick Bywater's case, which you might have heard of because there have been novels based on it and at least one film made about it. Edith Thompson she lived in the suburbs of London. She was a lower middle class woman, unhappily married, having an affair with a younger man who was at sea a lot, and they wrote each other letters, and she wrote very frankly about their love and their reading. They were great readers. They talked about all their books they read. And she also, stupidly, flirted with the idea of kind of getting rid of her husband, Percy. And anyway, eventually, after many months, Frederick was home on leave, and it kind of all got a bit out of control, and he murdered her husband. He stabbed him on the street, and he was caught quite quickly by the police, but they found her letters to him, which looked terribly incriminating, and so they arrested her on a charge of incitement, and she was put on trial alongside her lover, and they were both found guilty, and they were both hanged, even though she hadn't technically played any part in the murder at all. And it was a case that absolutely gripped the nation at the time, and I think largely, partly because it was such a dramatic story and such a tragic story, but also because it pressed so many of the buttons of the day. She was this lower middle class woman who'd kind of claimed this grand passion. Her letters were incredibly emotional and rather wonderful in lots of ways. So, it touched on anxieties about the women's sexual agency and the new gains that women had made in the wake of the war and the suburbs and the rise of the lower middle class and everything. And it kind of electrified people. And I just became really fascinated with the idea of that kind of crime, which isn't, she and her lover, they weren't monsters, they weren't criminal masterminds, it was just this tragic criminal mistake that was made. And with that mistake, 3 people ended up dead, and people's lives were wrecked and plunged into nightmare. And I was really interested in that very domestic crime that just one moment and people's lives are just switched into chaos and dreadfulness. So The Paying Guest isn't in any sense a retelling of Edith Thompson's story, but that triangle, that very classic heterosexual triangle, the wife, the husband, and the male lover, I began to think, well, what would happen if the lover was a female, actually, you know, and you had this sort of lesbian element? What would that do to this scenario?
Because it creates a wonderful tension, which is if a relationship is more secret and more private,
Yes.
will it be spotted in the same way?
Yes. So it raises all sorts of issues about visibility and invisibility and protection and danger. And so it was, that's the novel came to life.
Because Francis's, must have been such a complicated time in history for a woman to exist. She's, as you say, a spinster, but she's actually, only 20, she's very young,
she's
isn't she?
27-ish, I think, yeah.
And would I be right in thinking that a lot of women couldn't find husbands because of the war and how many young men millions of men had died, so...
It was a particular issue for a certain class because, you know, a disproportionate number of middle and upper middle class men had been killed for all sorts of reasons. I mean, far more working class men were killed. I mean, I think for every one officer who was killed in the First World War, 20 lower rank men were killed. But yes, it was that the loss of those sort of officer class men had a big impact on their families, of course, and so there was seen to be, and kind of was really this sort of swathe of women. I think that's why there are so many, you know, there are so many spinsters in spinster aunts and spinsters generally in 20th century fiction. They sort of lingered on. There was this whole kind of generation of women who lost sweethearts or just, you know, lost the chance really.
And of course, one of the things about spinsters is that they keep living with their mothers, and which I was very struck by the relationship between Frances and her mother in The Paying Guest, and indeed between mother and daughter and The Little Stranger as well.
Yeah, there aren't many fathers in my books.
Sorry.
Fathers I tend to get rid of. Having two parents are a nuisance because we've all got parents or had them. So you've got to kind of address the issue. But two parents, it's just one parent too many, really, to have to deal with, I find. And it's usually...
That can't be the only reason that you don't have
It's usually the father who goes. So yes, in this novel, poor Frances is sort of stuck when we first meet her. She's had, as we discover, quite an interesting past, but she's kind of turned her back on it to remain with her mother. And, you know, she would have belonged to that last generation of women who would have been expected to stay at home and service the family, really, an unmarried daughter. This was still the time. I mean, Vera Brittain talks about this in Testament of Youth, her wonderful memoir of wartime life. You know, she was off nursing. She went to France and to Malta. And her middle-class parents, they'd moved to a flat. I mean, Vera's brother was killed. They'd moved to a flat, and their servants were a bit hopeless, and they couldn't cope. Looking after themselves, so they called Vera home, and she was very, very resentful of it. And she knew that if she'd been a man, they wouldn't have been able to do that. I mean, she did then manage to break free and set up home with her friend, Winifred Holtby. But it took a lot of pluck to do that, I think. And then, of course, within, I think, a decade, you know, that would have changed quite drastically. But this was the end of an era. So yeah, Frances is at home with her mum.
So while that kind of the lack of men are not why Frances desires women, sort of made clear that that's always been her predilection.
Yes.
But I was quite interested to know whether her mother really understood what was going on, or what her mother's feelings were about her understanding about her daughter being. Would now call her a lesbian. That wouldn't have been the word that was used back then either, would it?
People did use that word. Yes, I mean, I'm not giving too much away to say that, and you might have guessed it, when the moment Lillian appears in her kimono, you might have guessed it, but Frances and Lillian have an affair. And of course, so then there's the four of them in this house, Frances and her mother and Lillian and her husband, in a relatively small house, really, with hilarious consequences. But yes, of course, there's Frances's mother, and how much does she know? That became quite a poignant issue to me, really, because I think mothers always know, don't they? They know everything, really, but they might not want to know those things.
I assumed that the mother knew, but I wasn't ever quite sure. You know, you do find yourself projecting what you...
Yes, I think she just doesn't want to know. She doesn't want to confront it. So there's a very painful little conversation they have late in the book where they almost address it, but then they don't because they can't. So yeah, Frances's mother became very interesting to me. In the early drafts of the book, I really underused her, and my British editor said to me, I think you could probably do more with Frances's mother. I thought, God, yeah, you're right, because I did become very interested with the four of them, you know, sharing that house, and they're all unhappy in a way. They've all got things going on. But yeah, no, mothers don't do that well in my novels, do they, really?
No, no. I mean, do you have a conscious sense that you're interested in writing about mothers and daughters, or is it just sort of ended up coming through in your work?
I think, again, when you're writing about women's lives and you're trying to recover women's history, you know, it's mothers and daughters, they're right there, really, I think, because so many women's lives have been quite domestic, and you're talking about home life. And especially if, like me, you're looking at women who didn't get married, you know, didn't do that traditional thing, then often they were at home and they were having to negotiate that mother-daughter relationship. When I finished this book, I made a note of the things I shouldn't write about anymore.
What was on that list?
Shabby gentility was top of the list, because my last book, The Little Stranger, had a kind of a much grander family, but a sort of shabby genteel family. Houses were on the list. No more houses.
The houses as characters.
The house
I mean, that
becomes a bit of
came
a character,
through.
yeah. And then mothers and daughters. And I'm starting another book now, and it's set in a house. There's a mother and a daughter. I just cannot escape it. But I think I need to sort of lance the boil or something. I'm going to do that with this new novel, and then that's it. It's going to be set in space or something next time. But that's just another kind of house, actually. You think about Alien, you know, the film Alien. It's one of my favorite films, and it's a brilliant modern Gothic, because that spaceship is just like the kind of creaky old castles, really, isn't it? It's exactly the same. So it's
also got an excellent cat.
It's got a what? A cat,
A
Jonesy.
cat, an excellent cat.
Jonesy, is that right?
Alien, but also the white tank top, Sigourney Weaver in the white tank top was very important moment in film history, I think. Which I did want to ask, because with the exception of The Little Stranger, and I actually haven't read Affinity, that's one book I haven't read.
Oh, it's got a mother and a daughter in it.
Oh, has it? There,
yeah.
But all your books tend to be about lesbian relationships. That's right, isn't it? Affinity
Not
is
The
also,
Little Stranger, though.
Other than The Little Stranger.
Oh, sorry,
I mean.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right.
So, and one of the interesting things about that, though, is because that term has such different historical moments and meanings at different moments. And one of the great things, as I've sort of implied about The Paying Guest, is that the invisibility actually becomes a strength. Like you could see that it was a sad thing that it was invisible, but in fact, thank God it's invisible in this, you know, because it's a kind of protection. But in Tipping the Velvet, there's incredibly vibrant sort of queer culture. It's not just about being lesbian. But so, did you have a very explicit agenda about trying to uncover queer history as a writer?
Sort of yes and no. I mean, to say yes makes it sound like that's been my mission, you know, as a writer, and that certainly hasn't been the case. I haven't felt it in that way. It's been more about where my interest lies, really, I think, you know. I mean, I guess with Tipping the Velvet, that was the one where I'd been doing some academic work on sort of the gay underworlds of late Victorian culture. So I knew that there was this stuff. It was largely male, and I just kind of wanted to write a lesbian version of it, really. And so Tipping the Velvet for me was always a kind of fantasy history, really, as much as more than anything. And then having written that, you know, with Affinity, you haven't read it, but it's a much bleaker version of sort of Victorian lesbian life. It's much, the women are isolated, they don't have a community, they don't have a vocabulary, they're just kind of dealing with it as best they can. And since then, I think I'm very interested in the history of sexuality. I'm interested in secret histories, and of course, queer histories have often been one of the most secret histories of all. I like the fact that we do have some information about lesbian life in the past, which is very interesting and inspiring for me. But the fact that we don't have lots of information is also inspiring too, because I can kind of make it up. You know, I can fill in the gaps as a novelist. It's part of my job as a novelist is to do that. So I like the way in which I like academic histories of sexuality, but then I like the license I have as a novelist to maybe fill in those gaps and populate them a bit. I'm never quite sure if I am recovering lost histories or just
Imagining
possibilities.
histories.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of doing a bit of both, really. I mean, certainly the novels are often read as kind of lesbian realism, and I don't know if they are or not, really. So I had a review of this book, an American review at slate.com. What did they say? I really liked it. They said that the novel was like a queer retrofitting of a classic car. So it was like a classic chassis with a queer engine put into it, which I really, really liked. It just seemed to, I just kind of thought, yes, actually, that is what I'm doing, because I do love I do want to kind of recover something from the past. I want to kind of, I want that infrastructure. I want it. I want those artifacts. But I do want to infuse them with something that from now, it's definitely something that I'm taking there from now, I guess.
I'm very interested in what you said about tipping the velvet, because as I was reading that, I was wondering how much of that was real, because it was kind of such an extraordinary subculture you were just describing.
I wish I could say it was. I wish I could say there were lesbian pubs in the East End, but I think there were bits and pieces.
The phrase Toms?
The what?
The
sorry?
phrase Toms?
Toms. Oh, you see, this is an interesting thing about tipping the velvet, because I wanted there to be a vocabulary. If you don't know it, which most of you probably don't, it's a story of a girl. She's an oyster girl in Kent, in Whitstable, and she sees a male impersonator in the Victorian musical and falls in love with her. Male impersonation was mainstream entertainment in the Victorian and Edwardian musical. And they move to London, and then Nancy herself becomes a male impersonator on the stage. Her heart is broken. She goes on the streets dressed as a man, becomes a male prostitute, gets picked up by a rich, heartless lesbian who makes a sort of toy boy of her, and then she's abandoned by her, and then she finds true love in the East End with a socialist lesbian called Florence. And it was huge fun to write. I look at it now, and it's the only one of my novels that I've ever reread, and I look at it now and I think, oh my God, what a mess it is, and I want to tidy it up. But it was huge fun, and it was a great treat to write. So yes, it's really a novel it's a Victorian novel about doing the right thing, and the good people get rewarded and the bad people get punished, and Nancy has to pick her way through a range of kind of lesbian identities before she finds the right one. So I needed there to be different communities and different vocabularies. So yes, there's a word Tom that I use, which was kind of in use. Tommy was being used in the 18th century about sapphic women, masculine, butch women, we would call them. So masher wasn't a word for a male impersonator. It was a word just for a kind of a swell act, a guy, like Burlington Bertie kind of thing. But I used that as a kind of term for a male impersonator.
One of the very important things, particularly actually in The Paying Guests, but I think in your novels as well, is how people choose to identify. So it's not just what people are, as much as you can ever say what a person is, but it's how people choose to see themselves and what they choose to say that they are. Do you think that identity is something that people need to own, or it kind of takes them over and enforces itself upon the world? Because Lillian would not have identified as a gay woman,
no.
whatever language you use, whereas Frances relatively happily would. And that kind of twinning of women who both identify and don't identify as gay happens in quite a few. It certainly happens in Tipping the Velvet.
Yeah, I think people experience their identity in different ways, and in different ways at different times in their life. I know lots of gay people who are very clear about that their gay identity, they were born into it, or they discovered it very early, and that's that. I expect lots of straight people feel like that too. But there are other people my friend Sally has a great phrase for this. She says, some are born gay, some achieve gayness, and some have gayness thrust upon them. And I think there's no better way of saying it, really.
No, there's not.
And I suppose, and of course, when you're thinking about the history of sexuality, you become very sensitized to how how much sexual categories evolve and how much sexual identities evolve. And gay identities are evolving right now, I think.
Absolutely.
And that's a very interesting thing for me because I'm writing about gay identities in the past, but I'm very conscious that the categories I am taking are provisional and are shifting. I think gay identity is shifting with things that are happening around trans identity, that in really interesting ways. And I think that the barrier, the boundary between gay identity and straight identity is itself breaking down, certainly in the UK. I think for lots of young people now, it isn't just one or the other, it's something much more fluid, which I think is fantastic. But yeah, in my novels, I tend to have an attachment to the sort of gay identity I came out into in the 80s and 90s. So somebody like Frances, for me, is very clearly a lesbian in the way that I am. But yes, no, Lillian is, when we meet her, Lillian is straight. She's married. She's from a very conventional working class background. So maybe. I don't think she becomes a lesbian in the book. I think she falls in love with Frances, but that's not necessarily the same thing.
Have you ever, you obviously have, thought of writing a contemporary novel? Or do you actually really like the infrastructure of history?
Yeah, I never have really seriously considered writing a contemporary novel. I'm still very drawn to the past, and each book has tended to lead me to another one, still in the past. I'm not sure what my voice would be if I wrote a contemporary novel, or you might say that's a good reason to try to find out. I loved writing The Little Stranger because it was a very gothic novel. It's a ghost story, really, or a poltergeist story. And one day I might try writing a gothic novel set in the present. I think that would be an interesting thing to try. But I don't know.
Actually, with The Little Stranger, did you make an active decision not to have gay characters, and did you get lots of reviews that kept trying to kind of put you back in the gay box and say, but how come this isn't a gay novel, as if you had some responsibility to only include gay characters in your
I did a bit, actually,
novels?
Yes. I could tell very early on it wasn't going to be a gay novel. There wasn't. I could have shoehorned in a lesbian character, but I didn't want to, didn't feel. I just knew it wasn't a story about that. It wasn't a story about sexuality for me. It was other things. There is a character in it, Caroline, who's the daughter of the family, and who's a bit. But I was going to say butch. She's not even really butch. She's just.
She might have been perceived by others to be.
Some people saw her as a kind of nascent lesbian, or but I certainly didn't see her like that, but I'm very happy for her to be read that way. But no, people went to great lengths to read that book as lesbians somehow,
Yes, I did read one review which talked about how it was a queer novel because all the characters were deeply queer, as in the other sense of the word queer.
Yes. Well, some people identified Caroline, the daughter, as a lesbian, or other people. Somebody said to me that Dr. Faraday, who's the narrator, who's a male narrator, he must be a lesbian because of the way he fancies Caroline, because he fixates on her. She's got rather thick ankles and things like that. They felt that there was something intrinsically lesbian.
And only a woman could like a woman's thick ankles.
Yeah, I know. And somebody else said the house was the lesbian, which that was my favourite. It was a bit like Where's Wally in the end. There's got to be a lesbian in there somewhere.
Have you been? Is that frustrating to you, or it really doesn't bother you? Because I've read an interview you did where, after being shortlisted for the Man Booker at some point, you talked about it was very nice to be thrown into the mainstream in that explicit way by those kind of shortlisting.
Right. I don't know. I can only write the books I want to write. And of course, people always ask me, they've asked me from the very beginning, do you see yourself as a lesbian writer? And I've been writing for 20 years now, and I still don't know how to answer that question, because sort of yes and no is the answer to that. Yes, in the sense that if you look at my books, of course there is some sort of agenda there about women's history and lesbian history. So that, I think, I'd hate that to be not recognized, But at the same time, I don't sit there thinking, I'm a lesbian writer when I'm writing every day.
Like a kind of mantra.
Just, I'm just writing about character and story like any other writer. So I still don't know how to answer that question,
Well,
really.
and it's just a non sequitur, but it's something I just became a bit fascinated by. Is, are you particularly interested in fire? You have there's some great fires, not in The Paying Guest, but in The Little Stranger and Night Watch. You have extraordinary descriptions of fire and the way it takes over buildings. And yes, I'm playing Dr. Freud now. Kind of like,
In which books did you say so? The
Night Watch and Little Stranger.
There's a bit of a fire in The Little Stranger. That's true. I'd never thought of that before. I'm conscious that I do have some images that I'll return to. So wax often pops up in my books, and pearls. In fact, it's got to the point where I feel I have to put them in now because they're in all my books. And I think any writer probably has a fund of imagery that they return to. But fire I wasn't aware of. I mean, of course, I had to write about fire with the Night
Blitz.
Watch because it's set during the Blitz, and so it would have been a time when fires would have been kind of a very real threat in the city. And I put a bit of fire in The Little Stranger because I'd been reading a lot about poltergeist activity. It's a poltergeist novel, and fires are one of those things that pop up in poltergeist activity, sort of apparently spontaneously. They'll sort of just appear. I couldn't resist writing about that, really.
So I've asked this question specifically about The Paying Guest, but is it genre or the period in history that you tend to be drawn to? So in this case, it was a period of history. With The Little Stranger, did you want to write a poltergeist novel, or were you thinking about a novel set in the 50s and then the idea of it being more of a ghost story? Because you use genre in all your works.
do. I'm really interested in genre and in what genre can achieve, and in the way we can subvert genre, and in the way I think what sort of links all my books really is I'll often take on a genre, but write it with kind of emotional realism. I'm really interested in doing that, and so a book like Fingersmith, which is this crazy Victorian melodrama, where people are locked in asylums and hanged and all sorts of things. And I thought, I wanted to write that. What would it feel like if somebody had tricked you into a lunatic asylum?
So you take a melodrama and then imbue it with more realism.
What would it feel like if your mum had been hanged, when you were a baby? And so, I'm very interested in that. But with The Little Stranger, I didn't begin with the haunted house thing. I actually began with the period, in the sense that there's a novel called The Franchise Affair, which you might have heard of, by Josephine Tay, crime novel from 1948, which is a fascinating and, I have to say, rather loathsome novel, because she takes this, actually a true case from the 18th century, a girl who disappears and then claims she's been abducted by two women. And Josephine Tay wrote it with all the kind of class anxieties of the post-war period, in which, again, working classes were doing very well, and middle-class people felt very threatened by that. And so there's a girl in The Franchise Affair, Betty Kane, who becomes this monstrous kind of scheming, manipulative, working-class kind of minx who really almost destroys the life of this middle-class mother and daughter. And I found this story fascinating, and I really wanted to retell it from Betty's perspective and write a much more sympathetic account. And I just couldn't see really how to do it. And then I thought about teenage girls and poltergeists and things like that, and I suddenly thought I could turn this into a haunted house story, and I just loved the idea of that, and because I love ghost stories and the Gothic, and it just seemed like a great opportunity to do that. And then it evolved into something else in which my Josephine Tay sort of model kind of receded. It became a very different kind of story, but that was my starting point. So yes, that was very much about the genre.
Yeah.
Can I take on this genre and maybe use it to do something a bit different, and again write it with kind of emotional realism and see what happens.
Now I've got one more question for Sarah, then I'm going to throw to questions, so I wanted you to start thinking about those questions. And we'll be waiting for people to, a microphone will come to you before you can actually ask the question. But while people are thinking about what they might ask you, Sarah, I just wanted to ask you what the experience of having other versions of your work in the world, plays, television shows, films, how that has been. Have you been involved in various adaptations of your work, or do you just let it go into the world and see?
Yeah, it's been interesting, because there were there have been quite a few television adaptations now, but also just more recently there have been some stage adaptations. There's a stage adaptation of Fingersmith that premiered at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in the US earlier this year and ran for several months in their repertory theatre and did very well, and it was a really exciting show. And there's very soon, in a couple of weeks, there's a stage version of Tipping the Velvet opening in London at the Lyric Theatre Hammersmith, which is a wonderful old Victorian interior. And it's a fantastic adaptation, it's very theatrical. It's written by Laura Wade, this young woman playwright. It's fab, and so I've been revisiting this Tipping the Velvet in particular through her play script, and Fingersmith too. And it's I find it fascinating. You know, it's been I've never been creatively involved, I haven't wanted to be, but I've definitely been included in the process. I've seen drafts of the scripts and given feedback and things like that. Oh, there's also a Korean version of Fingersmith. Park Chan-wook. There's the director Park Chan-wook, who made Old Boy many years ago, and more recently Stoker. He does these rather kind of intense and sometimes very violent films. He's adapted, well, it's not really an adaptation, it's more sort of inspired by Fingersmith. That's being edited, I think, right now, or maybe even finished. It's been very interesting to see.
And The Paying Guest is what has been
Paying
optioned
Guest
for
is
television?
option for TV, and The Little Strangers option for a movie. So, yeah, I just find it fascinating on a technical level, really, to see how that translation happens, you know, the decisions that get made.
You don't try and undo decisions you made that you've regretted? Like, say, can this character do that, or...? No,
I don't. So it does make you reflect a bit on the structure of the story. Did you really need that character there? You know, what's the heart? A good screenplay, I think, can make you see what the heart of a scene is, and that's been good for me to take that back into my own writing, you know, and think about, yeah, what is the heart? It might be a single exchange, you know, 2 lines of dialogue might be the key to a scene, and I've tried to keep that in mind. You wouldn't know it from the size of that book, would you really? But I did try to keep that in mind while I was writing.
Okay. So, we're going to go to questions now. So, there's a gentleman down the front, and then there's a woman behind him about 4 rows back. Well, sorry, a couple of rows back, and then we'll kind of move up that way, I think.
Thanks for the wonderful conversation, Sarah. I guess eroticism, or perhaps a better word is sensuality, is a big part of many of your novels. When you started out, how comfortable were you with that, and has your relationship to those scenes changed across time?
Yes, I was going to ask that. It's a good question. Excellent question.
I've always been very comfortable with it. I mean, you have to remember, when I wrote Tipping the Velvet, I had no idea I would even find a publisher. I wrote it just completely for myself. But I wrote it at a very particular time for me, I suppose. But also, it was 1995 was when I started work on that book. I was living in London, very at home in this kind of lesbian and gay world of London. The lesbian community, it seemed to me, was changing. There were things like, there'd been a sex shop had opened, there were lesbian bars, there was a whole lipstick lesbian thing. It felt like a very sex-positive time after a period in which sex had felt a bit fraught, I think, for lesbians to talk about, not least because I think there was this anxiety that if you represented lesbian sex, it might be read by men or something. You know, it would escape the community, and that would be a really, really bad thing. And I think that anxiety fell away in the 90s, and the community we just became much more confident of our community, and we didn't, really care about the other stuff. And that's where Tipping the Velvet came from. I wanted to write a very frank and fun kind of novel about sexual pleasure, really. Not that it's full of sex, but there are definitely sex.
You do write sex extremely well, and you also manage to write it in a way that's not, it doesn't feel like it's being performed for the male gaze, so whether or not men read it and enjoy it.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know, I hope they
it doesn't
do.
matter.
Yeah,
exactly.
Fine, yeah.
It doesn't feel like it's being written out of any kind of cliched sense about how you might represent women.
No, I mean, that's
having
often,
sex.
When you see lesbian sex, we see it a lot now, but it's often a bit porny when we see it, and it doesn't feel quite authentic, does it? And when you do see it, like Orange is the New Black, I thought was wonderful because it did the sex. For one thing, there was a whole range of lesbians in it, not just one, And it felt very genuinely very sexy, and it felt kind of, there was something authentic about it. I don't know. So I've kind of always enjoyed writing about sex, I have to say, partly because it's a challenge, because we do see it represented a lot around us, but often in very lazy ways. You know, sex is a fascinating thing, and it isn't really at all about what you're doing with your body. It's about what's going on in your head, and that's what you, as a novelist, that's what you should be concentrating on, really, the impact of what's going on. And the messiness of it, you know, that sometimes it's not, it doesn't really work or something. I mean, there's a kind of sad, failed sex scene in The Paying Guest. There's one in A Little Stranger as well, and in a way that was they were the most interesting ones to write, because we don't tend to see those represented so often, but we all experience that, you know, time to time.
Oh, no, I've never happened.
You wouldn't know.
No, sorry. Yeah.
My question is actually my partner's question, who couldn't be here. And she was interested to know what you did your PhD in your English literature.
I did my PhD on the representation of the gay past, really, lesbian and gay history in British literature from the sort of 1870s onwards. So I started by looking at Victorian men and the idea of Greek love. You know, there was this great appeal to Greek love as a model at a time when homosexuality was sort of debased and criminalized. You know, it was a wonderfully enabling thing to be able to say, well, look, the ancient Greeks did it, you know, and they were great. And then I sort of moved through the 20th century, and so I looked at people writing about Sappho, or say Christina of Sweden. Queen Christina of Sweden was we would say she was a lesbian, and there were lots of different ways that people wrote about her, some positive and some negative. I looked at writers like Mary Reynolds writing about ancient Greece, and I came right up into the sort of 80s and 90s to write about contemporary lesbian and gay authors writing about history. So Jeanette Winterson to a certain extent, Chris Hunt, who you may not have heard of, but writes or wrote wonderful sort of gay men's historical novels, and they were a real inspiration for Tipping the Velvet, writing a kind of thoughtful but sort of accessible, rompy story about the gay past. So it was about change. It was about how representations of the gay past have changed as ideas about homosexuality have changed.
Thanks, Sarah, for being here, and also...
Hang on, who's that?
I'm just
here.
here.
Oh, thanks, yeah.
And also just for your amazing books that I think make queer women everywhere feel seen and represented, which is just really a rare thing. But I was just wondering, it sort of comes off that question a little bit, but I think you do so many things incredibly well that different audiences appreciate, but something I think queer women appreciate is the way you do the queer sort of flirtation and the queer lust and the love affair so authentically, and it's really amazing to see your own experience feel so familiar when set in, you know, Victorian England. Is there something about the way queer women sort of charm each other or are attracted to one another, or that kind of queer attraction that you think's different to the way the heterosexual kind of romance happens? And what do you think that is? What is it that you're capturing so well that I think people are really appreciating?
You're an expert on heterosexual romance?
Well, I tell you what makes a difference is that, of course, our society is organized around heterosexual attraction. Yeah. And so I was very conscious, for example, that, you know, getting Frances and Lillian together, basically, had to become a much longer, slower process than I anticipated. There's one moment really early on where Frances climbs the stairs and Leonard, who's the husband, kind of looks at her for just a bit too long. And in that moment, that was all I had to do to suggest that he's being a bit flirty with her. That was all I had to do. It took like a line. But I couldn't assume any of that stuff when I was writing about Lillian and Frances's attraction. Do you know what I mean? It just isn't there as a sort of representational possibility. So I had to it just had to be a much more tentative thing. It had to be built up, sort of layer by layer by layer. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know if that's something intrinsic about lesbian desire, but I think just that the cultural limits that are placed on women, even straight women expressing desire.
And the consequences of getting it wrong. That is, if Frances misread Lillian,
Yes.
It would be very incredibly awkward. They would lose
Yes.
their lodges.
So
There'd
you
be
have to
real
be absolute.
consequences.
Frances has to be absolutely certain,
Yeah.
you know, before she will make any kind of move on Lillian. And Lillian is going through this journey from, you know, so it's all a bit more fraught. It's all a bit more fraught, which, from a novelist's point of view, is very interesting, really. You know, sort of doing that painstaking charting of their growing intimacy, first as friends, but then as something else. At what point does it tip over? You know, Frances has this anxiety that she's behaving like a man, that I think I was very conscious of. This was a dynamic I hadn't written about before. You know, a lesbian and a married woman, a straight woman. You know, how does that work? At what point do they recognise their intimacy, and how do they signal it? They were all really interesting questions for me.
Okay, we've got a question. Yeah.
Yes. Hello. Hello. Yes.
Oh yes.
I want to say that it was the most riveting read that I've read for a long time, and I like the way that the lesbian aspect of the novel started right from the very beginning all the way through. There wasn't any question about that, so that as a lesbian myself, I could sink into the whole novel and really enjoy it. And the fact that it had a very positive ending, because there was a point there where without giving away
No
too much, where
spoilers,
the
yeah.
drama and the mystery and the terrible consequences that could have happened in the story were quite a bit trauma. You know, there's trauma happening, and goodness knows where it might end. But what I wanted to ask about is your writing practice. You know, as a very well-established writer who makes a living from her writing, which is a very rare thing, and especially a lesbian making a living from her writing. I was wondering about your writing practice. Do you write, regularly every day when you're in the middle of a novel, and continue to the end, or how do you work that out?
I do write every day when I'm writing. I mean, I'm not writing at the moment. I'm sort of pre-writing with, because I have an idea for the next book, and I'm just sort of at the point of researching it really and planning it. But even that, I will treat like a job. You know, I'm reading sort of full days every day, really, when I'm not here, obviously. But writing, I will. I'm usually at my desk about 8:30 in the morning, and then my working day doesn't really end until about 6. But my writing day, usually by 4, I'm kind of knackered, and then But then because I'm researching, I can just turn off the computer and read or watch a 20s film. You know, for research, that's a very nice combination for me. I keep a writing journal, which is interesting, and it's a very pedantic journal, just about how many words I've written each day. And how the day has gone, and it's just full of groans, really. It's just full of groans and curses, with occasional moments of excitement, as I feel like I've kind of made some progress. But it is a long process for me writing a book, and I do a lot of rewriting, lots and lots and lots of redrafting. This book took about 4 years to write. I can't quite believe it, really.
It's a very long book.
It's a long book, but it's not that long, you know. I mean, it's just, I just like to try things out, and before I know whether they're going to work or not. I can't judge things until I try them properly. And so I tried lots and lots of different versions of different things in this book, especially, actually, coming back to it, bringing Frances and Lillian together. I took them to the park, then I took them to the pictures, then I took them back to the park again, and I gave them afternoon tea. It was just this one chapter where they had to just cross that, you know. I tried all sorts of different things.
Sounding a bit like real life in some way.
Yeah, true. So yeah, a lot of patient rewriting.
Okay, we've got time for one more question, but then Sarah will be signing books, and you should feel free to ask questions when you do that, if you line up.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
We're actually travelling to London in a couple of weeks to see the stage adaptation
Oh,
of Tipping
great.
the Velvet, so we can't wait. But my question sort of follows on from that previous one about your style of writing and what you've just said about the paying guests, which is how do you know when that novel has finished? You know, how many sort of rewrites and redrafts and edits, and then you go, right, this is it, this is what I want?
When I'm exhausted, really, and can't do any more. I could always, you know, keep rewriting that book. In fact, bits that I read out, I do often edit them in order to read them. I can't leave it alone. But I don't know. You do have a sense of when it's there. Yeah, it's a very exhausting process. The last few months of writing a novel, and this book was particularly so. And I'd left that last. If you've read it, there's a very meaty last chapter. And I'd left it to last. I don't know why that seemed like a good idea, but because I was exhausted by the time I got to it. But it was a very, I knew what I wanted it to do, and I just had to keep going until I'd got it there. And so that's it, really. I suppose it's having a vision of what you want it to do, and then just keeping going until
Well,
you feel
apologies
it's
to
right.
people at the back who didn't get the chance to ask their question. I'm sorry, but Sarah, I'd like to thank Sarah, and hopefully you can get to speak to her outside. Thank you.
Thank you.